بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله وصحبه وسلم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته.
السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته.
عليكم
السلام شيخ.
Inshallah, nice to see you all. I just actually came to greet Mona Zakaria because you called me earlier on. So I was in Surrey State. So I thought, coming along this way, I'll just give him salams and take his dua and go on. But now he's giving you all of this barakah. So, inshallah, I'll read one hadith and then benefit from it. Whatever Allah opens up to us, inshallah, we'll try and explain as well.
For those online, we can share the screen with you. For those online, we can share the screen with you. But the projector doesn't seem to be working here right now. So because of that,
You have a clear picture now.
yeah. So I can share the screen with you as well. But the problem is that the projector is not working. So those in the class can't see the screen. I'm going to send this document quickly via WhatsApp. Right? So you can just open it on your phone, inshallah. Okay, no, I have it already. That's fine.
It's on now.
So, Dawrah. Okay, so I think we're on page 4 of the PDF.
There's a great virtue to reading the chains of transmission. And just by your exposure, you know that a narration is made up of two parts. One is the text and one is the chain of transmission. So the text is only as authentic as the chain of transmission. But that's basically in terms of, like a scientific appreciation of what a narration is made up of. But importantly for us spiritually, that chain of transmission is made up of luminaries. And our scholars have this maxim, this rule, in the dhikri salihin tanzilu rahmah, that when mention is made of the luminaries, then mercy descends. And this is something which has been tried and tested. One Yusuf Carr, the father of our late and esteemed teacher, he said that in India they would have the practice, whenever there was a calamity, then they would read Bukhari, which is the most authentic text after the Quran. They would do an entire reading. And the reason behind that would be that every narration has a chain of transmission. The chain of transmission is made up of luminaries. Now, when you invoke and you mention their name, then Tanzilur Rahmah, then mercy descends. Mercy descends. And I'm just quickly looking over the first sort of chain of transmission that links us to the author. And the author in turn is linked to the Prophet ﷺ, that these are made up of great luminaries. Great luminaries. I'm unable to give you a biographical sketch of each and every one of them, but they are great luminaries. Real, what we would refer to in Islamic context as rijal, men of great virtue, spiritual as well as their proactivism. Particularly the first part of the chain talks about people who had actually given their life for Islam. The seed basically has to, in order for a tree to grow, then the seed must be rendered asunder. It breaks up, it gives up itself, and then you have this tree coming through. many of these luminaries are found in this particular chain of transmission. So my idea behind that would be that when we read the transmission, it's just not names that are passing by, but rather these are great spiritual and intellectual academic giants that we are leading on. الحديث الثاني من صحيح مسلم وبه إلينا قال أخبرنا مولى قمر الدين أحمد الكوركفوري عندنا سند كذلك من مولانا يوسف كرات رحمة الله عليه. فبه إلينا عن علامة إبراهيم البلياوي عن شيخ الهند مولانا محمود حسن ذي الفقار علي عثمان الديوبندي عن الإمام محمد قاسم بن أسد علي الصديقي أن النوتوي رحمة الله عليه عن الشاه عبد الغني بن أبي سعيد المجددي عن الشاه محمد إسحاق الدهلوي عن الشاه عبد العزيز عن الشاه ولي الله الدهلوي عن الشيخ أبو طاهر الكردي عن والدي الشيخ إبراهيم بن الحسن الكردي الكوراني عن الشيخ سلطان بن أحمد المزاحي عن الشيخ خليل بن أحمد السبكي عن النجم محمد بن أحمد الغيطي عن شيخ الإسلام زكريا الأنصاري رحمه الله عن عز عبد الرحيم بن محمد بن الفرات عن محمود بن خليفة المنبيجي عن الحافظ شرف الدين عبد المؤمن بن خلف الدمياطي عن أبي الحسن مؤيد بن محمد الطوسي عن فقيه الحرم أبي عبد الله محمد بن الفضل الفراني عن أبي الحسين عبد الغافر بن محمد الفارسي عن أبي محمد بن عيسى الجلودي عن أبي إسحاق إبراهيم بن محمد بن سفيان النيسابوري عن الإمام أبي الحسين مسلم بن الحجاج النيسابوري قال حدثنا أبو بكر بن أبي شيبة قال حدثنا خالد بن مخلد وهو القطواني عن سليمان بن بلال قال حدثني أبو حازم عن سهل بن سعد رضي الله عنه قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله وصحبه وسلم إن في الجنة بابا يقال له الريان يدخل منه الصائمون يوم القيامة لا يدخل معهم أحد غيرهم يقال أين الصائمون فيدخلون منه فإذا دخل آخرهم أغلق فلم يدخل منه أحد. So this particular narration is found in the canonical work of Imam Muslim. So in terms of hadith compilation, narration compilation, the most authentic is Bukhari because his conditions, his criterion for determining a narration as authentic is of the highest criterion. Following him would be none other than Imam Muslim. One anecdotal piece of information would be that the compilers of the canonical works on narrations to reward you, and it doesn't mention what the reward, you already know what the minimum is. So it's going to be way beyond that. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept our fasting, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward us for it. So the idea is you find that other acts of worship, there's a prescribed reward for it. And there's an increase, but the increase is also within a certain framework. But we find that fast is singled out. In terms of the reward is going to be great. So fasting is like very special. And this narration talks to another aspect of fasting, how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala specifies it. So the narration reads that in paradise there is a door. And the name of this door is called Rayyan. The name of the door is referred to as Rayyan. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says on the day of judgment, the fasting persons, they will enter through this door. And it's exclusive. Again, talking to the exclusivity of the month of Ramadan. No one but the fasting ones will enter into this door. And the narration continues, so the angel will call out, or it will be called out. We don't know what the nature of that would be, but generally it's going to refer to an angel calling out, where are the fasting persons? In other words, where are those who have sacrificed their food, their drink, and their conjugal relations for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then they will enter therefrom. Once they've entered, then this particular door will be closed. So in other words, it's a temporary door, specifically for the fasting persons. And once the fasting persons has been granted that honor of entering through this door, then the door has served its purpose, and the door will be closed, and no one else will enter therefrom. Now, so this again indicates to us the importance of fasting. So we know there are many doors. I speak any correction, but there are 8 doors. Now, and we heard about this narration now that those of us who are fasting will enter through that door. The Prophet ﷺ was asked on one occasion, be certain of us that would enter through every door. In other words, all the doors of paradise will be open, and a person would be either bade enter into whichever door he pleases, or somehow or the other these doors will be unified, and the 8 doors becomes one, and he enters through those or that door. So the Prophet ﷺ, yes, they will be from amongst those, and one from amongst those would be our great master Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu, who will enter through all of those doors. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept our fasting, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala honor us with entering into paradise through the door which is referred to as Rayyan. Reading these asanid are very beautiful, mashallah. الحديث الثالث من سنن أبي داود وبه إلينا قال أخبرنا علامة الشيخ نعمة الله المعروف الأعظم عن الشيخ فخر الإسلام المراد آبادي عن شيخ الهند مولانا محمود حسن عن الإمام رشيد أحمد الغنغوي رحمة الله عليه عن الشيخ عبد الغني المجددي عن الشيخ محمد إسحاق الدهلوي عن الشيخ عبد العزيز عن الشيخ ولي الله عن الشيخ أبي طاهر عن والده الشيخ إبراهيم الكردي القراني عن الشيخ صفي الدين أحمد بن محمد القشاشي عن الشيخ أبي المواهب أحمد بن علي الشنواني أو الشناوي عن الشمس محمد بن أحمد الرملي عن شيخ الإسلام زكريا الأنصاري رحمه الله عن العز عبد الرحيم بن محمد بن الفرات عن أبي الحفص عمر بن الحسن بن مزيد بن أميلة المراغي عن الفخر أبي الحسن علي بن أحمد بن عبد الواحد الشهير بابن البخاري عن أبي حفص عمر بن محمد بن طبرزد البغدادي عن البدر إبراهيم محمد بن منصور الكرخي وأبي الفتح مفلح بن أحمد بن محمد الدومي كلاهما عن الإمام الحافظ أبي بكر أحمد بن علي بن ثابت الخطيب البغدادي عن القاضي أبي عمر القاسم بن جعفر بن عبد الواحد الهاشمي عن أبي علي محمد بن أحمد بن أمر اللؤلؤي عن الإمام الحافظ أبي داود سليمان بن الأشعث السجستاني. قال حدثنا أحمد بن يونس قال حدثنا ابن أبي ذئب عن المقبوري عن أبيه عن أبي هريرة رضي الله عنه قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم من لم يدع قول الزور والعمل به فليس لله حاجة أن يدع طعامه وشرابه. Another beautiful hadith mentioned to us with this particular chain of transmission that runs from us right back to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And another very important aspect of chain of transmission, this way of life that we have, it is something which is inherited and something which is transmitted to us. So there is an unbroken, uninterrupted chain from ourselves to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, both in terms of these narrations and both in terms of the Quran. One of the salient differences between the transmission of narrations and transmission of Quran is that the transmission of Quran is what they refer to as canonical, categorical. In other words, in each generation, in terms of the transmission of the Quran, such an amount of people narrate the Quran, pass it from one generation to another generation, that it is impossible for them to concur upon a lie. And therefore, the Quran that we have in front of us, we say categorically, without a shadow of doubt, that the Quran that we have in front of us is the very same Quran that was revealed to the Prophet ﷺ with absolute certainty. So, chains of transmission is part of our tradition. And these chains of transmission are made up of luminaries. And there's another lesson for us in that. And our scholars say very early on, Muhammad ibn Sirin, he had the statement, Al-Isnad, this chain of transmission that links you and me to the Prophet ﷺ. Min ad-deen is part of our tradition, it's part of our deen, it's part of our way of life. So therefore, فَانْظُرُوا أَمَّنْ تَأْخُذُونَ نَدِينَكُمْ. Be particular of who you take your deen from. From very early on, Quran establishes this phenomenon. إِنْ جَاءَكُمْ فَاسِقٌ فَتَبَيَّنُوا. If a person comes in of a dubious nature, then first verify the integrity of the person. You must vindicate the person first. Find out if he's a villain or he's a good guy or bad guy. You must check he's a good guy or a bad guy. Very early on, our scholars do say, "Sammi lana rijalakum," that you narrating something to me, mention your chain of transmission. And in today's time, with the information age, it is very important that we exercise caution, because whenever you take something religious from somebody, you first need to look at the integrity of the person. If you're happy with the person's integrity, then you take from him. But if there's a question mark on the integrity of the person, then you shouldn't be taking from him. I think it's a very important lesson. And you save yourself a lot of trouble, because you heard something, some information, and then you come to a scholar of integrity, and then you want to now correlate whether it's right or not. If you just did your basic homework, and the source that you heard it from initially is a dubious source, so you shouldn't even be bothering about it from the first place. So, the chain of transmission is part of our way. Be wary, even in today's time, from whom you take your knowledge. It's a sacred knowledge. You must exercise caution. You're not going to take your car to any mechanic. You're not going to take yourself to any doctor. You want a doctor of a certain repute. You want a mechanic of a certain repute. Likewise, the scholars, you need to have a scholar of repute. So this particular narration is narrated on the authority of Abu Hurairah. And you know that Abu Hurairah is one of the most prolific narrators from the Prophet. In other words, recorded, he narrates the most from the Prophet. So much so that the scholars joke, another anecdote, if you don't know who the narrating companion is, take a chance, wing it, and say Abu Hurairah, no probability you'll be right. Okay, you shouldn't do that. They just to indicate upon us the amount of narration that he actually narrates. Now, then Abu Hurairah if Abu Hurairah narrates so much from the Prophet, he becomes an important figure for us. And in turn also, he becomes an important figure for the enemies of Islam. Because if you're able to discount Abu Hurairah, in discounting him, you discount all other narrations that he narrates from the Prophet. So, if you find from your perspective that Abu Hurairah is narrating some incriminating material, then all you got to do is question his person, his integrity, and then you discount him and you discount all of his narrations. One of the most absurd criticism raised against Abu Huraira is Abu Huraira, and you would know, I'm speaking in terms of our lessons, which happened a very long time ago. You would know that in Arabic, a person has a name. For example, we discussed this, remember? A person has a name, and then he has a title, and then he has what they refer to as a patronym. So, for example, myself, my name is Muhammad. I could think of a few wacky titles for myself, but we leave that to understand the concept. And then my patronym would be Abu Ahmad, the father of Ahmad. So Abu Huraira is not his name per se. So Abu Huraira, because the incident is famous, you know, mustn't catch me. I'm just also watching from the one side of my eye, I can see him. But you know the dua, I'm sure you guys memorize it from now. I taught you guys the dua. So much effort, so much labor. I hope you guys didn't forget it. Allahumma inni laka famisini. That's why it's stood me in good state over the years, no? I must tell you. In trouble. So Abu Huraira, the Prophet, they used to have wide sleeves. So Abu Huraira stored a hirra. Huraira is a small kitten in his sleeve. So he got that name Abu Huraira. The Prophet had a habit of giving names like that. Anas, his younger brother, gave him the pattern Aba Umayr, ma fa'al al-Nughayr. He was playing with the bird flew away. So he said to him, Ya Aba Umayr, ma fa'al al-Nughayr, gave him this pattern. So they say that this must be a fictitious person because he doesn't have a name, he only has a pattern. But it's quite absurd because many of us, we don't know Abu Bakr's name. But the naming convention there was different. And so you give a patronym, and sometimes a person would be better known for his patronym than what was known for his own name. Like I have to think, you know, and sometimes I even get it wrong. When you ask me the name of Abu Bakr, I have to think what was his actual name. Because we all know him as Abu Bakr, and we know him more by his title as Siddiq, the truthful one. You know? So it's not an argument to be raised against an individual like Abu Hurairah. So what was his name? The scholars differ. Some say Abdul Rahman ibn Sakhar, and that is the famous one. Imam Bukhari was of the opinion that his name was Abdullah. But even Imam Bukhari was a great giant, but the majority take an alternate opinion, and they say his name was Abdul Rahman ibn Sakhar. The Prophet gave him that name, Abdul Rahman. In the period of ignorance, his surname was Abdul Shams. His name was Abdul Shams. So you see why the Prophet would have to change his Abd means slave, Shams of the sun. You know, you can't be a slave of the sun, you're the slave of Allah. So Abu Hurairah narrates this narration. It's a very, very important narration. I think it's very, very important. And it talks to this whole idea of, and it's a problem that we have in today's society to a certain degree. It talks about, you know, the fancy terms that they use would be, you know, the esoteric Islam and the exoteric. You know, the external and the internal. We're all about the external. So what is the external about fasting? You don't eat, you don't drink, you don't have conjugal relations. Number one, not necessarily so. Islam is a balance between the exoteric and the esoteric, the external and the internal. Now, all of these operational things within Islam, it's meant to serve a particular purpose. And that's a spiritual purpose. And spirituality is something which is internal. So unfortunately, many times we find ourselves on extremes. Generally, the Muslim public and scholars included, they find themselves on both extremes. Either you find a person who's completely exoteric, he does everything, like 20 units of prayer. You know, he doesn't fall prey to the new innovation of reading 8 or 10 in his estimation, and so he's number one. You with me? And the other guy, he doesn't even come. He's on the other extreme of the exoteric. Allah knows what's in my heart. Doesn't do anything. So this is the two extremes that we oscillate between. But Islam, optimally, or just Islam basically rather, is, you know, the exoteric and the esoteric. And this narration talks to that. Because the exoteric of fasting is abstinence, staying away from certain things. But the esoteric is what? One scholar beautifully said it. You're very familiar with Surah Al-Baqarah and the verses relating to fasting. You know, in Surah Al-Baqarah, in the second juz, Allah starts off by saying, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu kutiba alaykumus siyam. Allah talks about that. So then Allah lists you must follow me. Allah lists the rules. And all of a sudden, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, like, it appears to us that He changes the subject. And thereafter, like an interlude. Thereafter, Allah goes back to listing the rules of fasting. So I'm thinking about it now. So the first part talks about the rules of fasting in the day. Then the second part talks about the rules of fasting at night. Why the need for an interlude? Allah wants to tell you that if you apply all of these rules of fasting that apply to the day and apply to the night, don't forget these are operational things. That the most important aspect of it is to worship Allah. And what does Allah say about Himself? To gain closeness unto me. So these operational things is so that we can gain closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. إِذَا سَأَلَكَ عِبَادِي أَنِّي فَإِنِّي قَرِيبٌ. If they ask after me, what must you say? Qareeb, I am close. And our scholars say something beautiful. I heard also that all of Allah's names have counterparts, but the name Qareeb doesn't have a counterpart because the counterpart of Qareeb is Ba'id, and Allah is never far from you. Qareeb doesn't have a counterpart. Allah is always close to you. So our scholars say it's not about journeying towards Allah. It's about discovering Allah, because you don't have to journey towards. You travel towards a place because it's far, but Allah is never far. So it's not about traveling towards Allah. It's about discovering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So even the verses talks about the day laws, night laws, and in between, Allah is telling you, look here, the purpose behind all of those laws is ultimately for you to develop a sense of consciousness. And almost like a measure of the consciousness is that you realize that Allah is close. So this narration talks very clearly to that. The esoteric part of fasting. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala here, the Prophet sallallahu, he discounts, so like he discounts. It's a big thing for us. Fasting is all about not eating, not drinking, not engaging. It's like a type of exile. Our treats have been confiscated. Drinking, eating, and all the niceties that we normally enjoy. Right? So that's what fasting is all about. The Prophet sallallahu says in this beautiful narration, a very important narration. So you understand that framework for the narration. Two words you keep in mind: exoteric and esoteric. For us, it's the balance between the two, doing both. And if you don't have this balance, and when you on one of two unpraiseworthy extremes on both sides, and I think we have a penchant to be on the esoteric side. We say at-taqwa hahuna, Allah consciousness is here. That's an extreme esoteric approach to Islam. The operational aspects of Islam are very important. You can't develop spirituality. Allah has designed it as such unless you do the ritual acts of worship. They're there by design. So when you fast, you experience a certain spirituality which you don't experience when you do the pilgrimage, or you pray, or you do other things. So every act of worship has a certain condition, and if you don't do the act of worship, you won't be able to experience the condition. It is a deception of the devil for you to tell yourself that no, I'm okay, but you're not fulfilling your obligations, but you're still okay because it's coming from a good place. That's another buzzword going around. Right? We should be wary of that. These are ploys of the devil. Now, so man lam yada' qawla zur. So the Prophet says, man lam yada' qawla zur. Whoever does not leave off qawla zur, lying. Now, this is a spiritual ailment. Wala amal bihi, and practicing upon it. Now, فَلَيْسَ لِلَّهِ حَاجَةٌ, then Allah has no need أَن يَدَعَ طَعَامَهُ وَشَرَابَهُ, that such a person leave off his food and his drink. In other words, if he doesn't have that Allah consciousness, that esoteric consciousness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he does the exoteric things. But he's not conscious of Allah to a point whereby he desists from lying, and he desists from, these are just examples. The scholars are very clear. It's not, okay, so, I just need to stay away from lying, but everything else I can do. Dawrah had students, and this used to happen almost like every year. When it came to the verses, they sort of like preempted that we come into the verses now. كُلِّ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ يَغُضُّوا مِنْ أَبْصَارِهِمْ. Say to the believers that lower the gaze. All the verses that talked about girlfriend, boyfriend, they would stay absent. And then they tell their friends, I wasn't here yesterday, I'm okay. And the teachers would give like a precursor, coming to a class close to you, girlfriend and boyfriend. And then the students who stay absent thinking that if I stay absent, it's okay, I didn't hear it, So it's not like, only two things are mentioned, I steer clear of that, and then the others, the Prophet didn't mention that. No, these are examples. So other prohibited issues, if we don't have Allah's consciousness, we don't desist from backbiting, we don't desist from engaging in tale-telling and other vices that beset us. And then look, there's no real purpose in terms of fasting. And actually keeping this narration in mind would basically excrete our fast. Because Imam Ghazali famously talks about fasting. What does he say? You get the fasting of the layperson. You meet the basic exoteric criteria. Stay away from food, drink, and conjugal relations. But there's a level beyond that. And that is when you stay away from everything which Allah prohibited. Everything which Allah prohibited. And there's one narration, it's not vigorously authenticated, but our scholars employ this particular narration of a lady who was backbiting. And the Prophet ﷺ said that she had broken her fast. And backbiting is likened to consuming carrion, consuming dead meat. So then she was induced to vomit, and then pieces of meat came out in terms of the vomiting. So it's a horrendous thing. So that, from a certain perspective, from a spiritual, esoteric perspective, could very well break your fast. Our old people used to say, you might as well eat. You cannot eat. And that's not because that's because you did something like really abhorrent, something very like ugly in terms of Islam. So may Allah grant us the understanding. It was really beautiful reading through these narrations. I needed this reminder myself of these two narrations. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cause us to benefit therefrom. And when we started reading, these are all the chains of transmission coming from our beloved teacher. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant him a high abode in paradise. The first lesson we did, Kitabul Bir in Sunan al-Tirmidhi, he said to us that there's an abyss. These were more or less his exact words. There's an abyss of about 1400 years between yourselves and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But when you hear and you listen to his words, right, despite this abyss, allow it to have that impact that it had on the companions. Let that impact overcome you. How did the Sahaba, they were from the age of ignorance. They were rough and ready, but they became the best of men. How did they become the best of men? What was the reformatory measures that took place? It was the words of the Prophet ﷺ that came out of his beloved mouth and impacted on their hearts. It came from his heart and impacted on their hearts. So when we listen to these narrations, over so many years and through so many different conduits, I can't say much about the conduits in today's time, but alhamdulillah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed us that despite our shortcomings, Allah has honored us that we serve as a conduit through which the words of the Prophet ﷺ can be transmitted. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, despite your and my shortcomings, has also blessed our ears. We can actually hear these words. It must come through our ears and it must impact on our hearts and be a means of gaining closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Jazakumullahu khair al-jaza. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I was just going to sit here and chill out.